The winter that nearly broke Einar Halden began with dead barley, a roof patched 3 times with bad timber, and a debt tally nailed to his door like a threat carved in wood. He farmed a poor strip of frozen ground above the village of Frostmere, where the wind came hard off the fjord, and even summer seemed to apologize for not lasting longer. 2 failed harvests, a sick cow, and the burial of his wife Helga had left him owing more silver than any honest ploughman could gather before first thaw. Torvald Sorn, the village reeve and lender, carried that debt in a leather ledger and smiled whenever he touched its pages, because some men enjoy misfortune most when it can be itemized. If Einar could not pay by spring market, Torvald would take the lower field, the goat shed, and likely the labour contract of Einar's daughter Liv, who was 12 and too brave to hide how much she feared the arrangement. Einar told Liv that no one was taking her anywhere while he still had hands to work and breath to argue. But winter makes liars, even of good fathers, because weather does not care what promises sound noble by the hearth. Frostmere itself had grown smaller in spirit over the years, less a village than a cluster of households waiting to see who misfortune would choose next. Men watched one another's storehouses too closely. Women measured flour in pinches, and kindness was often postponed until after one's own roof had survived another storm. Stories about the orcs of the northern highwoods did nothing to improve such hearts, for the village remembered raids from older years and preferred fear passed down second-hand to truth gathered first-hand. To the people of Frostmere, an orc was hunger with tusks, whether or not the present winter had brought any such thing to their door. The storm that changed Einar's life arrived 3 nights before midwinter feast, not as clean snow but as screaming wind with sleet inside it, the kind that cuts a man's cheeks raw if he is foolish enough to face it twice. Einar had gone out after dusk because one of the goats had not returned from the thorn enclosure, and a missing goat in that winter was not livestock, but tomorrow's survival wearing horns. He found the animal huddled against the outer byre wall, shivering under drifted snow, and almost missed the darker shape collapsed beyond it where the wind had piled white around a body. At first, he thought it was a dead wolf or a poacher frozen hard, but when he bent close, he saw a green-skinned face half buried in frost, a braid tangled with blood, and the sharp line of a small tusk beneath cracked lips. It was a young orc woman, barely more than a girl in the eyes, bundled in torn fur and leather, with one leg bleeding through a snapped trap iron still clamped above the ankle. Every sensible fear Frostmere had ever planted in him rose at once, and every decent instinct rose with it, which is the beginning of most real moral tests. Einar looked toward the village lights and then back at the storm, knowing exactly what would happen if he carried her into Frostmere, and exactly what would happen if he left her where she lay. The storm decided part of it for him, because the orc girl opened her eyes only once, tried weakly to reach for a knife that was no longer on her belt, and then whispered a word too broken by cold to threaten anyone. Einar muttered a curse at the gods for arranging choices this badly, hoisted her with more effort than grace, and dragged both goat and stranger toward the byre before the wind could kill all 3. He laid her first on straw beside the warming stones, then fetched hot water, clean rags, and the iron saw he used for cutting broken tack, because the sprung trap on her leg had bitten too deep to be removed by brute force alone. Liv found him there before he could invent a better lie, standing in the door with a lamp and wide blue eyes, seeing at once that the bundle on the straw was not an animal and not a neighbour either. She asked if the stranger would die, which was perhaps the most useful question in the room, since it put survival before the villagers' gossip. Einar answered that the stranger might live if they worked quickly and quietly. And Liv, who had her mother's steadier courage, set down the lamp and went for bandages without another wasted breath. Together they pried open the trap, cleaned the leg, and bound the wound while the orc drifted in and out of consciousness, flinching hardest not from pain, but whenever Einar's knife came too near. The injury was bad, but not ruined, a deep crush with torn flesh rather than shattered bone, and Einar thanked every half-forgotten saint of farmers that he had once learned enough animal doctoring to tell the difference. When the girl woke properly near midnight, she tried to sit, failed, and fixed Einar with such ferocious suspicion that even half-frozen she seemed more accustomed to fighting than trusting. He He raised his empty hands and told her, slowly and in the trader's northern tongue, that if he wanted her dead, he would have left her outside where the storm had nearly finished the job for free. That brought the faintest narrowing of her eyes. Not belief exactly, but an acknowledgement that he had spoken without flinching from what she was. She gave her name as Karra Stonefang, though the second word came out like a title as much as a clan mark, and then she fell back against the straw, too exhausted to explain more. Einar told her his own name and Liv's, which felt dangerously intimate under the circumstances, but introductions make even desperate arrangements less likely to become nightmares. By dawn, the storm had buried most tracks, but secrecy in a village is never about whether someone saw the first thing. It is about how many other things must be managed before the second and third are noticed. Einar moved Karra from the byre to the root cellar behind the kitchen wall, not because she was a prisoner, but because no passer-by would question why the lower hatch stayed bolted in hard weather. He gave her his late wife's thickest blanket, a bowl of broth thinner than he would have liked, and the only honest warning possible: if Frostmere discovered an orc in his house, mercy would not be the first instinct in town. Karra listened, ate without complaint, and said that if discovery came, he should tell them she forced her way in and threatened the farm, as though even in weakness she was already trying to offer the only protection she had left. Einar answered that he would think about lies later and about keeping fever out of her wound first, which earned from her the kind of look people give when unused to simple decency. Over the next days the weather trapped all of them indoors more thoroughly than any guard could have done, and necessity began carving trust from the edges of fear. Liv brought water, broth, and once a scrap of dried apple she had hidden from the feast stores, saying quietly that medicine goes better with sweetness, which made Karra blink as if 12-year-old generosity were the strangest thing in the north. Einar cleaned the wound morning and night, changed dressings, and kept the small cellar fire fed despite the cost in fuel, because a frozen guest is only a slower corpse. Karra bore pain with a clenched stillness that told him much about her life before either of them spoke of it directly. On the third day, when she could sit without swaying, he noticed the tattoo at her wrist half hidden by grime, a ring of black peaks around a single red line, old clan work done by someone whose hand understood both ritual and authority. When he asked about it, Karra said only that Stonefang blood is expected to stand in front when winter comes hardest, which answered the question obliquely enough to suggest importance without boasting. Einar suspected then that she was more than a stray scout. But poor farmers survive by not forcing every dangerous truth into daylight before it knows what shape it wants. Outside, Torvald's collectors kept making their rounds, striking doorposts with canes, and reminding every debtor that midwinter pity did not exist in ledgers. Torvald himself came to Einar's yard on the 5th day, wrapped in fox fur and smugness, with 2 broad sons behind him, and a look meant to count every weakness a household could not hide. He asked after the goat stock, the field tools, and Liv's health with such oily interest that Einar wanted to shut the door on his teeth. Instead, he stood in the snow and endured the reeve's recital of sums, penalties, and the little extra charge now added because Einar had missed a cart-hauling obligation during the storm. While Torvald talked, Karra crouched silent beneath the cellar hatch with a borrowed knife in hand, close enough to hear the man pricing another family's future as if he were bargaining over rope. After Torvald left, Liv said she hated him more than the winter, and Karra, from the cellar shadows, remarked that such men exist among orcs too, though they often wear war paint instead of fur collars. It was the first joke, if dry and cruel, that Karra offered them, and somehow the house felt less like 3 frightened people sharing a secret and more like an alliance. By the end of the first week, she could limp a little on a stick and had begun helping from below stairs in whatever ways secrecy allowed, sorting turnips, shaving, kindling, and teaching Liv how to tie a snare knot that wastes less cord. Einar caught them once laughing over the problem of whether human chickens are braver or merely stupider than mountain birds, and the sound startled him because grief had made his house quiet for so long he had almost forgotten humour could live in it. Trust deepened not in speeches but in chores and watchfulness, in Liv carrying stories downstairs at night and in Karra listening as Einar repaired harness straps by the fire just above her hidden shelter. When he finally asked why she had been alone so deep near Frostmere, Karra gave the answer in pieces, as if deciding how much of her life a stranger had earned. She said the Stonefang tribe had taken heavy losses the previous autumn when a sickness swept their high camp, leaving children weak and elders fevered. She had ridden south with 2 others to barter for salt, iron nails, and dried herbs from river traders, taking the low forest road to avoid known village watch lines. But before they reached the barter cove, masked men hit the party from the pines, not common thieves but hired hunters with chain nets, wolf traps, and the cruel efficiency of people paid for live quarry. One companion died covering the retreat, the other scattered into the storm, and Karra herself escaped only by cutting her pony free and plunging blind through the timber until the trap caught her near Frostmere's outer pastures. Einar asked whether the hunters were from any tribe feud, and Karra's mouth tightened before she said no, these were lowland men who knew too much about orc roots to be acting alone. That answer lodged in his mind like a splinter, because lowland men who hunt people for payment are rarely far from other businesses that smell of debt and land hunger. Karra also admitted, after a long pause, that she was not merely a trader's daughter but niece to Karra Stonefang, chieftain of the winter camps, and blood kin to the line that carried the tribe's wolf spear. Einar absorbed that with the weary practicality of a man already hiding one impossible thing, and therefore too tired to rank a second according to its theoretical danger. He said only that Frostmere would likely panic more, not less, if it learned the orc girl in his cellar was important enough to ransom or kill for politics. Karra answered that if the tribe learned he had sheltered her when others would have sold her, Stonefang memory would not forget it, and she said this not as a threat but as a fact from a culture where debts were carried differently. Einar almost laughed at that, because in Frostmere the poor remembered debts obsessively, while the powerful remembered only credits owed to them. As days passed, Karra's strength returned fast, youth and stubbornness working together where thinner broth and cracked herbs ought not to have been enough. She began rising to the kitchen after dark when shutters were closed, moving carefully but with the restless dignity of someone unwilling to remain hidden any longer than necessity required. Liv insisted on teaching her a card game with rune-marked slivers of wood, and Karra lost the first 3 rounds badly because human bluffing made less sense to her than direct wagers. In exchange, Karra told stories of the high camps, of snow bridges over gorge streams, of summer grazing ledges where goats climbed like small, arrogant spirits, and of Stonefang council fires where even chiefs listened when old women spat at bad ideas. Those stories softened something in Einar, not because they erased old raid memories, but because they replaced the shapeless word orc with a world populated by grandparents, camp rules, embarrassing cousins, and people who argued about stew just like anyone else. The first moment of true danger came when Liv's friend Cellar arrived unexpectedly with a basket of fish bones for the goats and almost caught sight of Karra's shadow moving behind the pantry door. Einar talked too loudly about salted herring to distract her, while Liv deliberately knocked over a bucket in the yard to pull Sailor away, proving children can become expert conspirators far faster than adults would prefer. Afterward, Karra rebuked them both for risking too much on her behalf, but Liv answered that once someone shares your house in winter, they are partly your problem, which may have been the most Frostmere way possible to define loyalty. Not every lesson was gentle, however, because scarcity sharpened all edges, and each extra bowl given to Karra was a bowl not saved against later hunger. Einar counted grain every night, and knew with growing clarity that if the storm season ran long, his mercy might cost his household more than Torvald ever needed to threaten. He said nothing of this until Karra caught him measuring flour by candlelight, and understood at once what kind of arithmetic pressed behind his silence. The next day she asked for her knife back, climbed painfully to the outer slope after dusk, and returned with 2 rabbits and a brace of ptarmigan caught in snares set where wind packed seed husks against the hedges. Liv stared at the hall as if magic had visited supper, and Einar realized then how different survival looks in the hands of people who have never assumed a market will repair their mistakes. Karra said the mountains teach waste as a kind of sin, because anything you fail to learn while fed will punish you when the snow comes to test the lesson. From then on, she and Einar worked together in the grey hours, checking hidden lines, cutting extra peat, and saving more food than the farm alone could have managed. Her presence did not erase the debt, but it changed the household from waiting for ruin to preparing, which is often the first step by which despair loses ground. Midwinter feast came and went with low fires and thin ale. Frostmere pretending celebration while everyone counted what remained of winter's stores. Torvald hosted the village gathering in the hall as if generosity and debt collection were 2 faces of the same god, and Einar attended only long enough not to draw suspicion with absence. There he heard a rumor from trappers newly returned from the river road. 3 men had been found dead in the pines, throats cut clean, one with a broken wolf trap chain still looped over his pack. Einar came home with that news like a hidden ember, and when he told Karra, she nodded once and said one of the surviving traders or her missing companion had likely answered the ambush in proper fashion. But she also said hunters do not vanish without being noticed by whoever paid them, which meant more eyes might soon begin searching for what had slipped their net. The warning proved wise sooner than anyone wished. 2 days later, Jost, one of Torvald's sons, appeared near the outer paddock, asking idle questions about unusual tracks, missing sheep, and whether Einar had seen strangers during the storm. His tone was careless, but his gaze kept drifting to the byre and wood pile as though he expected secrets to leak visibly through boards if stared at hard enough. Einar lied with the flat patience of a man accustomed to low officials and sent him away with a sack of spoiled oats as a distraction. Yet the encounter left the whole house tighter with fear. That night, Karra said the time had come for her to leave, because each day she remained increased the chance that whatever trouble chased her would swallow the Haldens with her. Liv protested immediately, and even Einar argued that the wound was not yet ready for mountain travel in deep snow. Karra answered that if she delayed too long, her tribe might assume her dead and shift camp beyond any easy search, which would make every risk already taken by the household worthless. The argument lasted until the fire sank low, not because any side lacked affection, but because all 3 now had enough of it to fear what the right choice might cost. In the end, Einar agreed to help her leave after the next clear morning, once he had repaired the old sledge and packed what food he could spare. Liv spent the night sewing a strip of blue wool into Karra's cloak seam so, as she put it, there would be something of the house with her when the snow looked too empty. Before dawn, Karra confessed one more truth Einar had not asked for but perhaps needed. Stonefang did not forget gifts, but neither did it forget injuries, and if Torvald or any lowland men had been feeding hunters toward their camp, there would be payment beyond silver due soon enough. Einar said he wanted no blood spilled for his sake, only safe passage for her, and Karra gave him a look that held both respect and the faint amusement warriors reserve for farmers who still believe justice can remain tidy once violence has started its count. They set out under a cold, clear sky that made every ridge sharp as hammered iron, Einar pulling the sledge while Karra walked when she could, and rode when the legs stiffened too badly. Frostmere shrank behind them into a smear of smoke and thatch, and for a few hours the world felt open enough that one could imagine mercy travelling safely from one people to another. The forest disproved that hope by noon when brinjack crows burst from the pines and a crossbow bolt thudded into the sledge rail, an arm's length from Liv's blue sewing. 3 hunters came fast through the trees, fur-cloaked and masked with leather strips, carrying nets and short spears better suited to capture than honourable combat. Einar had his wood axe and little else, yet he stepped between Karra and the first rush without thinking long enough to call the choice brave. Karra, wounded or not, moved like the stories Frostmere told with too much fear and too little accuracy, catching the second man's wrist, turning his spear aside, and driving him face first into the snow before he could recover. Einar took the first attacker across the shoulder with the flat of the axe, because even in ambush he was a farmer enough to hate killing at arm's reach. The third hunter tried to circle behind, but Liv, who had been told to stay low and disobeyed in the practical manner of desperate children, flung a snow shovel into his knees and bought Karra the heartbeat needed to finish the fight. When the attackers lay dead or fleeing, Einar found on one man's belt a bronze token stamped with Torvald's store mark, a sign used for warehouse tallies and grain cart claims. Karra saw it too and said nothing for several breaths, which made her eventual words heavier. Now the tribe would know this was not accident or wild road greed, but lowland treachery with a named source. They could not risk continuing all the way to the high camps after the skirmish, so Karra led them instead to a hunter's cleft hidden between two ridges where a signal fire might be seen by Stonefang outriders if any remained on winter watch. There she taught Liv how to stack green pine over dry spruce for smoke and showed Einar the whistle call used by the tribe along the cliff trails. They waited until dusk, and just as Einar began to fear the snow would keep every answer away, two grey wolves trotted into view, followed by riders on shaggy mountain ponies. The first rider lowered her spear point at the sight of humans beside Karra, but the second recognized the clan token at Karra's throat and shouted a name that broke into relief. Within moments, the hidden cleft filled with Stonefang scouts, green-skinned men and women in winter leathers who looked first ready to kill and then ready to kneel once they understood who had brought their chief's niece back alive. Karra introduced Einar and Liv plainly as the ones who sheltered her, dressed her wound, and fought hunters rather than sell her, which caused the scouts' suspicion to turn into an intense, silent regard that was somehow more unsettling than open hostility. Their leader, a scar-jawed woman named Vika, examined the bronze store token and swore that if a lowland reeve had paid for Stonefang blood, then the mountain would answer in the only languages such men respected. Einar repeated that he wanted no massacre over a kindness, but Vika answered that this had ceased being about kindness the moment hired hunters crossed clan law and tried to net one of Briga's blood. Even so, Karra took his concerns seriously enough to insist they escort him and live safely home before the tribe chose its own response. The return journey to Frostmere felt stranger than the outward one, for Einar now walked beside 6 armed orc scouts through woods where his neighbours would have screamed at shadows, and found that fear weakens when reality insists on becoming specific. At the farmyard, Vika promised that Stonefang would remember, then rode back into the dusk with Karra after the orc girl pressed her forehead briefly to Liv's in farewell and told Einar they had not seen the last of her. The house felt emptier than Einar expected that night, as though winter had taken back a warmth he had not admitted it gave. Yet there was little time for sentiment, because the bruised hunter who escaped the ridge fight had reached Frostmere before them and fed Torvald a different story. By the next morning, the reeve arrived with both sons and 2 hired men, accusing Einar of consorting with raiders, murder on the forest road, and theft of a marked store token from lawful agents. Einar denied nothing except the lie at the heart of it, saying he had defended his daughter and his guest from slavers carrying Torvald's own mark. Torvald's face tightened for one revealing instant before he recovered his outrage, and Einar understood then that the man truly had been paying hunters for live orc captives, perhaps to sell south where such cruelty drew coin. Frostmere's neighbours gathered at the lane, not close enough to help, but close enough to hear whether the accusation would become a hanging offence or merely another debt added to Einar's ledger. Torvald declared the farm forfeit at first thaw and said that until settlement Liv would be lodged in his household as guarantee against further treachery, which was the polite legal form of a threat Einar would rather die than obey. Einar put his hand on the chopping axe by the door, and for a terrible second the yard balanced between one father's despair and several men's willingness to break him for profit. It was old Marta, the widow from the next plot, who interrupted by stepping from the crowd and saying she had seen Torvald's men hauling wolf traps north for weeks, though she had kept silent from fear of what such truth costs the poor. Her words did not stop Torvald, but they seeded doubt in the crowd, and doubt is often enough to prevent villains from claiming righteousness as easily as they prefer. Torvald withdrew only because he wanted law's appearance on his side, promising to return with written claim at month's end and armed authority if needed. After he left, Frostmere split itself in the usual way. Some neighbors warned Einar he was doomed. Some admired Marta's courage only once the danger had ridden off, and a few quietly brought kindling or meal to the house because people prefer generosity once someone else has taken the first risk. Einar spent the following days preparing for siege rather than spring, hiding tools, reinforcing shutters, and teaching Liv where to run if men came before he could stop them. Part of him considered fleeing entirely, but poor farmers cannot run as lightly as stories suggest, because land is not simply where they stand, but the sum of every object they cannot carry. Meanwhile, high in the winter woods, Karra had reached the Stonefang camp and delivered both the tale of her rescue and the bronze proof of Torvald's treachery. Chieftain Karra Stonefang received the news in the great hide shelter before the council fire, her hair braided with wolf teeth and her authority so calm that even anger seemed to straighten itself before speaking. She listened to Karra without interruption, asked exact questions about the Haldens, the hunters, the token, and the debt hanging over Einar's farm, and then called the old debt keeper of the tribe to witness every word. Among Stonefang, a saved life creates obligation, not in vague gratitude, but in measurable honor, and the greater the risk of the rescue, the heavier the debt written in memory. Brigga said Einar Halden had given shelter in starvation season, protected blood kin against paid hunters, and refused reward before the account was even offered, which made the obligation twice as binding. She also said that Torvald Sorn had done more than threaten one farmer, for by trafficking in Stonefang lives he had trespassed into blood business where no lowland ledger could shield him. The council debated how to answer, some urging a raid by night and the burning of Frostmere's reeve house, others warning that punishing one guilty man by terrifying a whole village would stain the very debt they meant to repay. Karra herself argued hardest for restraint, saying Einar had shown her the difference between a cruel man and a frightened community, and Stonefang should answer in a way that honored the first truth without forgetting the second. Brigga agreed, but only in part, because mountain law made room for both gold and blood where appropriate, and justice that neglects either generosity or punishment becomes weakness in different clothes. So she decreed a double repayment. First, the full sum of Einar's debt with lawful market measure in silver, amber, and winter gold taken from an old river cache. Second, a war ban sufficient to shield the payment and strike down any man who raised unlawful violence against the debtor or his house. By Stonefang custom, the debt would be paid publicly and before witnesses, so that no one could later twist the story into rumor. Karra asked leave to ride at the head of the party, and Brigga granted it with a small proud smile that said rescue had returned something more than a niece to her camp. In Frostmere, the last week before month's end passed like a knife drawn slowly across a whetstone, each day sharpening dread rather than relieving it. Torvald's sons walked the lanes with deliberate swagger, measuring Einar's field markers and joking loudly about what color Liv's apron would be once she served in the Reeves' kitchen. Einar nearly broke Jost's jaw for that remark, and was saved from worse only by Liv grabbing his sleeve and reminding him that dead fathers do less good than angry living ones. Marta continued bringing news, and from her Einar learned Torvald had indeed summoned hired blades from the river landing, perhaps suspecting the farm would not yield quietly. Brother Anselm, the little hall priest, also visited once and urged Einar to submit to lawful process, which sounded noble from a man who did not expect his child to be handed over as collateral. Einar answered more sharply than piety preferred, and spent the rest of the day ashamed at a gentler man while still unconvinced by him. Dawn on settlement day came iron cold and bright, with every roof in Frostmere edged white, and the fjord lying still as a blade before a strike. Torvald arrived at mid-morning in his best fur mantle, a ledger case under one arm and 6 hired men besides his sons, enough force to make the scene look official, even if justice never joined it. Half the village followed at a distance, because people will miss their own chores before missing a public ruin. Torvald read out the sum with penalties enlarged beyond honesty, named Einar in default, and ordered the goat shed and lower field marked for seizure at once. When Einar refused to surrender Liv into service, the reeve nodded to his men as if they were about to collect a bundle rather than a child. Liv stood by the door with a wood axe too large for her arms, pale but unbacked, and Einar felt then the exact hard edge of helplessness that turns decent men into desperate ones. Jost and one hired blade stepped toward the house, and Einar raised his own axe, knowing he was outnumbered and perhaps already lost. The first horn cut across the moment before steel met flesh, low and deep from the north road, unlike any village signal Frostmere had ever used. Everyone turned toward the ridge track where snow blew aside from a line of riders descending through the birches, grey ponies, fur-cloaked warriors, and spear tips flashing like cold stars. At their head rode Karra Stonefang, upright now, wound hidden beneath winter leathers, with a wolf spear pennon tied below her saddle, and her chin lifted in a way that made the whole village forget the half-frozen stranger Einar had once dragged from adrift. Beside her came chieftain Byre herself, older, broader, and terrible in calm, followed by 2 sledges guarded on both sides, one carrying iron-bound chests and the other carrying 3 bound men whose faces were bruised into unwilling honesty. Frostmere recoiled at the sight, but the Stonefang party halted in precise order rather than chaos, forming not a raiding rush but a delegation under arms. Byre dismounted first and declared in a carrying voice that Stonefang came under debt law, witness law, and blood law to repay farmer Einar Halden and to address crimes committed by Torvald Sorn against both host and clan. Torvald tried to laugh, claiming he did no business with beasts, but the bound prisoners on the second sledge were his river hunters, one of whom still wore a store token, and another who had clearly decided survival now required an abrupt respect for truth. Karra named them before all present as the ambushers on the forest road, and Veka the scout stepped forward to display the snapped trap iron taken from Karra's leg and the ledger scraps found in one hunter's pouch showing payment marks tied to Torvald's seal. Murmurs ran through Frostmere like fire in dry grass, because greed is tolerated more easily than slaving, and Torvald suddenly looked less like a strict reeve than like a disease everyone regretted letting inside. Byre then ordered the first chest opened, revealing weighed silver rings, amber lengths, and gold arm rings enough to make even Torvald's hired men stare. She asked the village measurement to step forward and count the value against Einar's written debt under public witness. Old Hakon the measurement came trembling from the crowd, ran the tally twice with hands that shook harder at the numbers than at the orcs, and announced that the chest covered not only the full lawful debt, but every honest penalty a fair reeve could have claimed. Byre said Stonefang paid its life debts in full, and she placed the counted silver at Einar's feet rather than Torvald's, making plain who was creditor, who was debtor, and who had forgotten the difference. That should have ended the matter under any society interested in law more than power, but Torvald had built too much of himself around ownership to surrender gracefully in public. He shouted that no orc gold would touch Frostmere law, snatched for his knife, and ordered his hired men to seize the chest and kill the witnesses if they wished their own crimes kept from the Jarl's ears. The yard exploded into violence so quickly that the first clash of steel seemed less like a beginning than like truth finally taking physical form. Vika speared the nearest hired blade before he reached Liv, while Karra met Jost's rush with the shaft of her wolf spear and struck him down so hard he forgot whatever bravery borrowed authority had given him. Einar drove his axe into the doorpost to catch a sword meant for his shoulder, then followed with the brutal practical swing of a woodcutter defending home rather than honour. Byre did not fight wildly, but with the grim economy of a chief who knows every death under her command must be justified later to memory. Frostmere's villagers, seeing Torvald's treachery stripped bare, at last chose sides with the speed people often discover only once danger becomes expensive to ignore. Marta clubbed one of Torvald's sons across the back with a milking stool. Brother Anselm dragged Liv clear of a falling body, and even old Hakon, the measurement, used his scale rod to trip a mercenary trying to flee with the gold rings. The blood price finished quickly after that, because hired men do not die bravely for masters whose lies are already known. Torvald himself tried to run for the lane, but Karra caught him before the gate and forced him to his knees in the snow before Byre, Einar, and the gathered village. Brega said Stonefang Law would have been content with silver repayment had he only been a hard creditor, but slave hunting turned the account darker and demanded blood answer blood. She looked to Einar then, not because Torvald's fate belonged to him alone, but because the host who saved her kin had earned voice in what followed. Einar, breathing hard and spattered with more violence than any ploughman should know, said only that Frostmere must never again mistake cruelty for law, and that whatever judgment came should be public enough to teach it. So Brega left Torvald alive for the Jarl's justice, but marked him before all with the broken trap iron hung around his neck, a sign of slave-taking shame that made the villagers turn their eyes from him as if filth had finally found its proper visible shape. His surviving son was bound beside him, the hired men disarmed, and the chests of payment counted once more, this time into Brother Anselm's custody until the Jarl's rider could witness settlement beyond any future tampering. By afternoon the fight was over, Einar's debt formally erased, and Frostmere stood in the stunned quiet that follows any day in which the world reveals it was built around a lie everyone had tolerated for too long. Before leaving, Brega added a second gift beyond the counted payment: seed grain, 2 mountain goats, and a pouch of river gold for Liv's future, saying blood debts may be closed, but honoured friendships should remain open roads. Karra embraced Liv openly before the whole village and clasped Einar's forearm warrior style, telling him Stonefang would name his house Friendfire in winter songs so long as the tribe remembered its dead. Spring came later that year with slower thaw and cleaner consciences, and when traders next passed through Frostmere they found a village telling a different story about orcs than the one Fear had once found so easy to repeat. And if anyone asks how a poor Viking farmer sheltered an orc girl during winter only to have her tribe repay his debt in blood and gold, the truest answer is this: he chose mercy when mercy was expensive, and in return he learned that among honourable people, whether of farm, fjord, or mountain, kindness is never forgotten, but weighed, remembered, and answered with everything necessary to set the balance right. If you want more stories from Orc Chronicles, stay with me for the next one.